سيدنا مولانا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا مولانا محمد بارك السلام عليكم. صلاة وسلام عليك يا سيدي يا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. We'll continue today with Ahlul Bayt, which, as I said, will continue for the next several weeks, inshallah. Last week, I kind of want to go over a few things from last week kind of quickly. And one was one of the things that I'd mentioned. We had talked about Khandaq and Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam tying 2 stones to his belly. And yet other times where he's fasting for 40 days straight, no food, no water, and it's not affecting him physically. And yet here, we see these signs of some physical effect. But as I said, this was so that there would be that connection between him and his companions. This is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't send angels as prophets. Because then, there's that excuse that how can we be like that? Or how can we follow, someone like that who's not even like us? And so Rasulullah is showing these human aspects. And the companions, they understood this, and this is important to understand. And I'm also going to talk about another point where someone didn't understand it and he reiterated certain points, but that will be later on, inshallah. But like for Khandaq itself, if you read about Khandaq, they were digging the trench. That trench was 3 miles long, 30 feet wide, 20 feet deep. And each group of men were assigned to 10 yards of digging. And they came to a point where this huge rock that no one could break. And it's in the way, and they got to get it out of the way. So they understood. So they came to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who took a pick, and he struck the rock with the pick. And he struck it 3 times. And each time when he struck it, first time he struck it, this huge spark came out. And they said, it was like a spark that could have lit the night up. And he says, Allahu Akbar, as he's striking it. And then he says that I have been given the keys to Sham, to Syria, or ancient Syria, which of course at that time included, what is today modern-day Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and all that area was Sham. And he says, I have been given the keys to Sham, and I'm seeing its palaces. And then he strikes it again, and the same, this similar spark. And when he struck it the first time, it starts to crumble. And he strikes it the second time, and is continuing to crumble. And this another huge spark comes out, and now he says that I've been given the keys to Persia, and I am seeing the White Palace in Madain. And then he strikes it the third time, saying Allahu Akbar again, and again this spark comes out, and he says that I have been given the keys to Yemen, and I am seeing the gates of Sana'a while I'm still in my place. Sana'a, of course, was basically the capital of Yemen. And it's kind of interesting, and by the time he finished, there was nothing left but dust. But it's interesting that he's foretelling all of these things at a moment in history if you look at it from the outside with no iman, the Muslims are about to be annihilated, because you have this massive coalition that Quraysh have formed, with all the various tribes in the area, and including Ghatafan, which was this large Bedouin Najdi tribe. And they're coming to basically put an end to all of the Muslims in Medina Munawwara. And so he's making these statements at this time when somebody who has no faith would look at this and say, oh, they're about to be destroyed. There's nothing going to be left of them. And again, this was done at a time when he has 2 stones tied to his belly. And he strikes this huge boulder. And, if you know the terrain of Medina, Medina lies between 2 rocky volcanic tracts. So you can assume that this was some form of volcanic rock. So it probably had some iron or ore in it as well. So you have these huge sparks coming out, and all of this. And so it's very interesting. So the companions, they understood this point. Yeah, he's got 2 stones tied to his belly, but he's not like us in that sense. And that's why they came to him. And that's why he picked up that pick and struck the stone and basically made it dust. And this was also the time when he foretold, about the martyrdom of Ammar bin Yasir, radiallahu anhu, because Ammar radiallahu anhu was digging, because when the companions, they saw him with these 2 stones tied to his belly, it made them, gave them more strength to do what they needed to do. And they worked more aggressively and harder. And you think about it, they dug this trench in about 18 days by hand. So it's not a small feat. But Ammar bin Yasir was digging, very, very eagerly and with a lot of enthusiasm, and so Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says about him that he'll be martyred by a rebellious group, or a group that has passed all bounds, and so he was martyred in the Battle of Siffin, fighting on the side of Sayyidina Ali, karamallahu wajh. So that's one point that I wanted to kind of reiterate about that question. And I'm sure that brings up other questions as well. But the other point that I want to make right at the beginning is, we talked about this where, whenever Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would relieve himself, you'd have nothing but the smell of, or a fragrance better than musk, and no one ever saw any sustenance of what he had relieved, because the earth would swallow it. And for us down here in the South, this should be something easy to understand. Because there's that saying, and I won't use the actual words that are used, they'll say that, oh, you think that his crap doesn't stink. Somebody loves somebody so much that, to him, that other person's crap doesn't stink. And this, I don't know if it gets used very much now, but it was something that at least used to get used a good bit, a couple of decades ago. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the lover of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he is his creator. So he creates him. It's like a mother. She changes her baby's diaper. Everybody else is, running for the hills, and she's there, and it doesn't affect her. And why? Because of that connection between her and that baby. Here, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is Habibullah. He is the beloved of Allah, and not only is the beloved of Allah, he is the creation of Allah. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created his beloved, so that literally what came from him, nothing stank. And this is also another point as far as prophethood. All of the prophets were very attractive men, so that no one could have the excuse that they were repulsed by them. And so there is nothing of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam that in the least way would be repulsive to anyone. So having said that, I'm going to move on and kind of, start where we left last week. We were talking as far as Ahlul Bayt. And we talked about the birth of Sayyidina Ali karamallahu wajh. And I also mentioned that Bibi Fatima salamullah alayha was born in the year of revelation, or a year before or a year afterwards, but according to most scholars, the year of revelation. And for the first 3 years, you have the secret propagation, and then we talked about, the gathering that Rasulullah had Sayyidina Ali karamallahu wajh as well as his father Hazrat Abu Talib radiallahu anhu arrange, when he was inviting Banu Muttalib and Banu Hashim to Islam. So, this was the 3rd year of the mission. And this is basically the point when Quraysh become very aggressive against the Muslims. This is where we start seeing, their animosity, their physical, abuse of the Muslims, and not just the downtrodden. So if you had somebody who was even well-to-do, who became Muslim, their relatives would abuse them. And simple example of this is Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu anhu. So Uthman radiallahu anhu is from Banu Umayyah, very well-to-do. When Islam came, he was about 33 years old. So he, of course, accepts Islam in that secret time of propagation. But now that things have become open, his stepfather, or not his stepfather, but his uncle, Hakam. Hakam, who is his, direct uncle. So he's the brother of Uthman radiallahu anhu's father. When he found out that Uthman radiallahu anhu had accepted Islam, he wrapped him up in a carpet and lit it on fire on both ends. And Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu was a witness to this, and he's the one who saved him from this and brought him to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu kept Uthman radiallahu anhu in his house. And then eventually he was married, Uthman radiallahu anhu was married to the daughter of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Bibi Ruqayyah. So the next 2 years, or rather the next few years, but starting from the 3rd year of the mission, and we get to the 5th year of the mission. So basically these 2 years you have nothing but persecution, and this is also when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he allows some of the companions to emigrate to Abyssinia, and amongst these is Uthman. So Uthman radiallahu anhu is the first to emigrate with his wife. So he's the first to emigrate with his wife, and he's also amongst those who emigrated twice. And so he initially immigrates to Abyssinia. Eventually he comes back to Makkah, before the emigration to Medina Munawwara. But this is also the time when one day when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he would come and pray openly, even when he had told everybody else to pray secretly. So he would make his salat openly, and he would come to the Kaaba, and he would pray from the side of Rukn Yamani, so the Yemeni wall, or the Yemeni corner. So because the Qibla was Masjid al-Aqsa, which was in Jerusalem, and so he would basically place the Kaaba in between himself and the Qibla. So this shows you his love for the Kaaba. But what happens? So he had his routine, and he did not change his routine for anyone. So which is interesting because everyone else is affected by their environment. The exception to this are the prophets, because they didn't come to be affected by the environment, they came to affect the environment. So, the Quraysh, they knew when he would be coming. They knew, oh, it's about time for him to be coming to make his salat, or his prayers. And so one day, Abu Jahl, they're sitting, because the Kaaba, basically what would happen is all of the bigwigs, all these guys who thought they were important, they would sit around the Kaaba and basically, kind of talk to each other and just kind of, chew the fat, just talk nonsense and just, make themselves look important, sitting there, or talk business. And so one day Abu Jahl, he says to his compadres that are sitting there with him, he says that so-and-so has slaughtered a camel, so when Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam comes, who will put the guts of that or the entrails of that on top of him when he is in sajda? And Uqba bin Abi Mu'ayth, who is the stepfather of Uthman radiallahu anhu, he immediately pops up and he's, I'll do this. So he goes and he drags those and the guts, with him, and of course on time Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam came. He was making salat. When he goes into sajda, Uqba throws all of this on top of him, places all of this on top of him. And all of them sitting there get a chuckle out of this. And in the meantime, and the narrator of this is Abdullah ibn Masud radiallahu anhu. The narration is in Sahih Muslim. And he says that he was powerless to do anything, because all of the Muslims that were around who wanted to do anything, were being held back. However, there was one person who broke through. And that one person was the daughter of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the leader of the women of Jannah, Bibi Fatima salamullah alayha. And again, she is roughly about 5 years old at this point. So that's one thing to remember. And she comes and she's crying, seeing this scene, and she pulls all of the guts and everything off of her father. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he's not fighting any of this. He just remained in sajda. And they get all of this off of him. And while she's doing this, she has some words with the Quraysh leaders, who were basically the culprits involved in this. And they said some things back to her, and again they were laughing at her as well, at this scene. And they thought that this was funny. And so Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he completes his salat calmly. And then he stands up and he looks at them and he says, "Oh Allah, punish Quraysh. Punish Abu Jahl, Hisham, Amr bin Hisham, which is Abu Jahl. Punish Utbah bin Rabi. Punish Shayba bin Rabi. Punish Walid bin Utbah. Punish Umayyah bin Khalaf and Uqba bin Abi Mu'ayth." And there was one other, that Abdullah ibn Masud radiallahu anhu says that there was one other, there were 7 names that he took, and he says, I can't remember the 7th. But he says that all of them were killed in Badr. So, several points here. Since I've said this, I need to kind of clarify certain points before I come back to the point that why I'm talking about this at this time. It's well known that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam never prayed against anyone. But there is a catch in that, is that he never prayed against anyone for any personal issues. And the rule here is that to forgive your own rights is a sign of decency. Someone who gives up his rights, for the better good, that's a sign of decency, like Imam Hassan al-Islam did. But to give up the rights of the ones that you love is a sign of hypocrisy. And this is why Imam Hussein al-Islam did not place his hand in the hand of Yazid, because he knew who Yazid was and what Yazid was doing, and Yazid was violating the rights of Allah and His Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So if he's the lover of Allah and His Messenger, then how can he, agree to this? So he's not willing to agree to this. So here, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is in the condition of salat, and so they are attacking the salat itself, and then they also attack and ridicule his daughter, who is again the leader of the women of Jannah, the beloved of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the beloved of Allah. And so he cannot overlook the rights of Allah, and he is not willing to overlook the rights of Bibi Fatima, salamullah alayha. And so this is why he responds in the way that he does, because when he said this, Quraysh themselves were taken aback, and they said, oh, and they knew now that they're in trouble. Just a matter of when. And so, but the reason I'm talking about this now, because we're talking about Ahlul Bayt. And again, Bibi Fatima salamullah alayha, she is central to Ahlul Bayt. And so, it's interesting to see that whenever situations came up like this, because we're talking about this incident now, but even years later, we talked about this in Jummah when the Battle of Uhud takes place, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is wounded. Who is the one who shows up there and cauterizes the wounds other than Bibi Fatima salamullah alayha? And here also, even at the age of 5, she is the one who is removing all of this from on top of her father. And so she has this special place, and we need to kind of understand that. This is, interestingly enough, this was also the incident that triggered the iman of Hazrat Hamza radiallahu anhu. And a few days later, after this incident, is when Umar radiallahu anhu becomes Muslim. And then all of the Muslims started praying openly. And so, so again, when we talk about Ahlul Bayt, we see those that are there to defend the honor of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They are central in that. And we will see later on that they will also be central in defending the honor of the companions of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So now when we look at this, so now for the next couple of years, again, things are the situation in Makkah is not good. So this was 5th year of the mission. And so the 7th year of the mission is when Quraysh get together, the various clans of Quraysh get together, and they form an agreement. Because they've been coming to the uncle of Rasulullah, Hazrat Abu Talib radiallahu anhu, and requesting that he hand him over. They've made various offers to him, including, you hand him over and we will give you one of our best sons, and he'll be yours to raise, but just hand over Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam for us to do whatever we please. And so, and of course, he always refused. And one time he even said, he said, even a camel, a she-camel does not give up her child. How can I give up, my son? Because, and here he's not talking about literal son, but he is the uncle. So he says, how can I give him up? I will never give him up. And so, they kind of, when they saw that they weren't getting anywhere in this manner, So now this is when they come up with an agreement that they will boycott Banu Hashim, which is a clan of Rasulullah until they give up Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So give him up so that we can do whatever we want. And they, and this agreement that they formed was that no one will do any business dealings with them. No one will marry into them. And they cannot marry into any other clan. And they would basically be isolated in their area. They could not basically leave their area. And so this boycott goes on for 3 years. And the thing though is here, Banu Muttalib, and we talked about them again, Banu Muttalib, who were the cousin clan to Banu Hashim, they joined with their brothers and said, no, we are with you. And so they were also part of this boycott. So these two groups were, or these two clans were part of the boycott. And even the non-Muslims amongst these two clans were included in the boycott. So they also suffered, because they were also amongst those who were refusing to give up Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And of course, for them it was more on a tribal basis, but for the Muslims, of course, this was a religious thing. And doesn't matter how much you've stored up, eventually stuff runs out. And so for these 3 years, the Muslims were basically living off of dried leaves. If they could find some fat, and the fat would be rotten and old, they would eat it. If they found pieces of leather, they would chew on it just to get that semblance of eating something. Occasionally you would have somebody sneak something in, but that was not an everyday occurrence. That was an occasional occurrence. So you end up, basically you have two clans amongst Quraysh that are being starved to death because they want Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and because these two clans refuse to give him up. For these 3 years, though, there was always that fear that Quraysh would sneak in at night and assassinate Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so Hazrat Abu Talib, the uncle of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, would have his nephew sleep somewhere else every night. And he would have his own son, Hazrat Ali, sleep in the bed of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, so that if they came, they would find his son and not find Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this went on for 3 years. There were a couple of people from amongst Banu Hashim who were not part of this boycott, but they were not Muslim, and and of course the most famous of these is Abu Lahab, who not only is not Muslim, but he is also the enemy of Allah and His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, even though he is the uncle of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But he excluded himself from Banu Hashim. You know who your friends are when times are tough. When things are good, everybody joins in. And this is also why there were certain things that later on that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam restricted, as far as beneficial things, that he restricted to Banu Hashim and Banu Muttalib. Because he said that only those who took part in our suffering can now take part in this joy. So that has, again, if you can't suffer with somebody, then that means that you really have no connection to them. Everybody and anybody joins in when things are good. The hypocrites join in when things are good. So again, we see Sayyidina Ali, karamallahu wajh, taking up this position And because everybody talks about him sleeping in the bed of Rasulullah on the night of the Hijrah. But most of us don't know that he did this for 3 years. That wasn't something new to him. This was something he had done for 3 years, every night during this time, because again, they want to assassinate him. And this is also by the end of this, so 10 years after 10th year of the mission, so after 3 years of this boycott, eventually the boycott is lifted. And one of the things that happens is that when they've written this boycott, they wrote it down or this agreement, they wrote it down and signed it on 2 pieces of paper. One of which they had basically hung in the Kaaba, and the other Abu Jahl had kept safe with himself. So if anything happened to the one in the Kaaba, then he could pull out this one and say, see. And so at the end of this time, 10 years, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says to his uncle, he says the boycott's over. Because the agreement is no more. And the termites have eaten it. Because this is before paper. So they were writing on papyrus or on leather or on other things. This was written on papyrus. So the termites had eaten it. And the only thing that remains is the name of Allah, of that piece of paper. And so Hazrat Abu Talib came and made the announcement, and Abu Jahl said, what do you mean the agreement's over? The boycott's over. He said, no. And he said, this is because there's nothing left of the agreement. And they opened the Kaaba and they looked, and truly there was nothing left of the agreement except for the name of Allah. Bismika Allahumma is what they would write, so that name of Allah was still there. Abu Jahl goes running to his copy of the agreement, and when he opens up the chest that he had kept it in, same thing, nothing left except for that. And so, but even here Quraysh didn't stop until a few days later, when certain other people who were not Muslim from other clans stepped in and said, no, we're not going to be part of this anymore. And so again, we see Ahlul Bayt, Sayyidina Ali Karamallahu Wajhu, again being there, whenever things are needed, and for whatever he is needed. Because they consider their lives nothing compared to the life of Rasulullah. And they consider their lives only worth living if it was spent, defending the honor and the life of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So that's the 10th year of the mission. So now, the next 3 years, the boycott's over. Within a short period of time, the wife of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Bibi Khadijatul Kubra, she passes, and she passed from the effects of starvation, from the effects of these 3 years. And so she passes, and so she is the mother of Bibi Fatima Salamullah alayha. And within a few days, the uncle of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Hazrat Abu Talib, also passes. So the 2 people that defended and supported him the most have now passed, and this is why Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he referred to this year as Amul Huzn, the year of sorrows. But now, so this same year is when he went to Taif, and we know what happened in Taif. This is also the time that he goes for the Mi'raj, the ascension, the night journey. But the thing that's happening in Makkah is that for these next 3 years he goes to the people that are coming for the Hajj, to the various clans, and he offers himself to them. But he only takes 2 people with him on this mission. And those 2 people are Hazrat Abu Bakr and Sayyidina Ali, karamallahu wajh. And it's interesting because Abu Bakr, radiallahu, he was the master of genealogy. So he knew whose clan was what, and whose clan was honorable, and whose was not. And Ali, radiallahu anhu, who at this time, is basically the beginning of this time is roughly about 20 years old, and at the end of this time will be about 23 years old. He's never taken part in a battle. And yet Ali is the one who's analyzing, whether these tribes or these clans will be strong enough to defend Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So these are the only 2 people that he took. And they would go and they would come, they would go and meet the clans when they would come for Hajj. And then they would come to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and say that, such and such, they look like they're a promising group. They've got decent lineage. They're known to be, whatever, to have some decency, and they can defend us militarily. And then Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would go and offer himself to these clans, and they would, all of them rejected him, which was what we knew, and what Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had already told us. Because we knew, and he knew, and he had already told us that he would be making immigration to Medina Munawwara, which at that time was known as Yathrib. But the attitude here, which is kind of important to understand, the attitude of the tribes from Najd was very hostile to the extent that some of them literally cursed him. And those that were willing to take him were only willing to take him under one condition. And they said to him, that, look, we're willing to take you under the condition that when all of this falls under your feet, after you, power will come to us. So for them, it's always been a thing of power. And we see that today. These clans or tribes from Najd. So now, when, so eventually, of course, the agreement is made with the people of Aqaba, or the agreement of Aqaba with the people of Medina Munawwara, which at that time again was known as Yathrib. So they agreed to take him. And, this I'm not going to focus on too much, because everybody knows that when he immigrated, of course, Ali radiallahu is the one who slept in his bed. Abu Bakr radiallahu is the one who traveled with him. And when Ali, because he had told Ali radiallahu, he said that I have certain trusts that have been given to me, and you will return them tomorrow, and then join me in 3 days. And of course, when Ali was asked later on as to how he felt that night, he said, I never slept better in my life, because I knew nothing was going to happen, because Rasulullah had instructed me to return the trust, and he had told me to meet him in 3 days, so nothing's going to happen to me. Even though if I look at it from the worldly standpoint, he's sleeping in the bed of the Messenger of Allah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who everybody is targeting. All of Quraysh are basically waiting outside of his door, one young youth from every clan waiting outside of his door, so that, as soon as he walks out, they're going to attack him. So of course, there's a high likelihood that if no one walks out, they will break the door in and attack him. And yet Ali says, no, that was the best night's sleep I ever had. But the other important point to note that most of us don't focus on is if somebody gives me a trust from an Islamic perspective, like somebody gives me something as safekeeping, then I am the one, because he gave it to me, who should return it to him. And if I can't myself return it to him, then the one who can stand in my place will return it to him. And so this is Ali radiallahu anhu. And we see the same exact thing happening in the 9th year of Hijrah, when Rasulullah sends Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu as the head of the Hajj, the Amir of the Hajj. And and after he leaves and Abu Bakr radiallahu arrives at Dhul Hulayfa. Dhul Hulayfa is the area right at the outskirts of Medina Munawwara where you put on the ihram. So it's just 3 or 4 miles right at the outskirts of Medina Munawwara. The verses come down from Surah Tawbah, which basically annul any agreements that were with the non-Muslims, and basically commanding them to leave Mecca, and that they had 4 months in which to leave because they had already violated all of these agreements anyway. And so when the verses came, the order was that they should be recited by Rasulullah or by his tongue. And so Ali radiallahu anhu is the one who was sent to do this. When Ali radiallahu anhu, when he arrives, so he gets on the camel of Rasulullah and goes and joins Abu Bakr at Dhul Hulayfa. When Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu hears the camel, he's in his tent, he hears the sound of the camel of Rasulullah. He says that this sounds like the camel of Rasulullah. And this is something that's hard for us to understand, but this is that area of love, where the lovers, they even know the sounds of the animals of the ones that they love. And so when he arrives, they see that it's Ali radiallahu anhu. And so Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu asks him, he says, have you come to follow or have you come to lead? And Ali radiallahu anhu, he says, no, I've come to follow. He says, then why did you come? He says that I was sent by Rasulullah to recite these verses. So Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, he says, well, I can recite the verses. He says, no, because I was commanded to recite the verses, so I can't give these over to you. So then he asks, he says, did some verse or some revelation come about me? Because now Abu Bakr is concerned for himself that maybe Rasulullah or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is upset with him. So he says, no, I don't know. Ali, I don't know if any verse came or any revelation came about you. He says, so Abu Bakr gets up, he leaves Dhul Hulayfa, he comes back to Medina Munawwara, and he says, Ya Rasulullah, did some revelation come about me? He says, no. He says, then I could recite the verses. He says, no, because either I recite the verses or the one who can stand in my place recites the verses. And so this is why Ali radiallahu anhu will recite the verses. And we see this. So Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu gave the khutbah in Hajj, but the verses were recited by Ali radiallahu anhu. And so we see that same thing here as far as returning the trust. It has to be Ali, because he is part of that blood, so he can stand in that place and say, well, I'm returning this in place of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I'm going to end here as far as this aspect is concerned. There's another point that I wanted to make, kind of covers several things that we've talked about before, and and aspect of a question that came up last time as well, is that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, in Surah Hijr, Surah number 15, verse number 9, He says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم إنا نحن نزلنا الذكر وإنا له لحافظون. That indeed we are the ones who have revealed this dhikr, this remembrance, and we are the ones who are its guardian. It's interesting, of course we understand, everybody understands that, here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about the protection of the Quran. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't say the Quran, He says this dhikr, this remembrance. Which is not limited to the Quran itself. Because a lot of us, when we talk about revelation, we talk about the Quran, but we forget that everything that came from the lips of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is also revelation. وَمَا يَنْتِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَىٰ إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيٌ يُوحَىٰ, which is Surah Najm, Surah number 53, verses 3 and 4. That he does not say anything from his own nafs. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam doesn't say anything from his own nafs, from his own self, but everything that he says is nothing except revelation. Okay, so that whatever he says is exactly as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants him to say it. Not only wants him to say it, but loves for him to say it. Where he says it, when he says it, how he says it, to whom he says it, every aspect of his saying. So this is also part of the remembrance. And the Quran is not just the words of the Quran, but the reason for revelation. The Shan and Nuzul cannot be separated from the Quran. The bayan, or the explanation, which is Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself, is the explanation to the Quran. Again, you can't separate those. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't say that we are the ones who have revealed this Quran and we are the ones who will protect it, but He says we are the ones who have revealed this revelation, this remembrance, and we are the ones who will protect it. So that includes, the ahadith, and I'll get to how that includes that now. We all know that the Quran is the Quran, and there is no dispute about the Quran. As far as, is this the Quran or is this not the Quran? This is the Quran. Okay. Yet about the hadith there is dispute. The Quran is protected in such a way that there is no dispute. The hadiths are also protected, so they're all there. The only thing is that there is dispute. So even within the dispute, there's that protection of it all being there. The thing is that becomes more part of the test. When the issues and the civil war was about to start during the time of Sayyidina Ali, karamallahu wajh, and all of this propaganda was being, spread around. He himself, he said, "O people, many narrations will come to you, but before you accept anything, then see if it is befitting to the honor and the status of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And if it's not, then toss it aside. Doesn't matter, how good it looks from the surface, or how strong the chain is. So if it is not befitting, then it doesn't meet the criteria." But also here, when all of this was going on, Ammar bin Yasir, he also emphasized the point. Again, we talked about Ammar. Ammar bin Yasir, because at this point, right at the beginning, you're having issues between companions and companions. And he said that, "O people, this is a test for you. That you follow. Do you follow Allah and His Messenger, or do you follow so and so and so and so?" And so, even though the ahadith are all protected, but amongst them you have those that are not. You have the, or rather, what I'm saying is, and I don't know if I'm making this clear or not, is all of the actual stuff is there. We just have to sort through all of the other stuff. Whereas with the Quran, there's no sorting. It's the Quran. Okay. But this also becomes part of the test, because now we see whose nafs or whose desires, lead him in what direction. Because if I'm truly doing this for the pleasure of Allah and His Messenger, then I submit to Allah and His Messenger. And again, whatever is in line with the honor and the status of Allah and the honor and the status of Rasulullah, that is something that's going to be easy for me to accept. And whatever is not, is something that I'm going to question. Whatever is in line with the status and the honor of Ahlul Bayt is something that's going to be easy for me to accept. And whatever goes against that is something that I automatically should know that, there's something not right here. This is also where, we talked about this before, about, the various categorizations of the hadith, as far as say, daif, and all of these things, and what those categories are based on. But what we forget also is that, what the Muslims have done traditionally also takes precedence. And this is where, these days there's this big push of, I can study on this, I can read this, and I can read that, and I can study on my own, and I have, no one to guide me, which basically means I have shaitan to guide me. But I can do all of this research myself, and I don't need anybody else, and which basically means that I'm following my nafs. When we look like the hadith which is in Tirmizi, where Imam Tirmizi, he narrates the hadith that about the virtues of taking ghusl or taking a bath on the days of Eid. And he says in the end, yes, this narration is daif, it's weak, but this has been the practice of the Muslims from the beginning. And so, if I'm looking at something, I look at all of these narrations in isolation, but I don't look at the precedent or how the righteous scholars, the traditional scholars in the past dealt with them, or used them, or did not use them, then basically I'm throwing away, all of that knowledge. And not just throwing it away, I'm basically insulting their knowledge and saying these people who truly were closer to the, and not just closer, but actually part of those generations that are protected, they didn't know anything. Suddenly now I know everything. And we see this, especially with the internet era, we see this very commonly with a lot of people. Because you can pull up YouTube and this and that, and you can pull up all of these sites, and you have people have no clue as to who the person who behind the site even is. There's so many sites that are being run by Ahmadiyya, the Qadianis, who claim that Mirza Qadian was a messenger. Astaghfirullah. He's a messenger for the British, but not for Allah. And so many other sites, and so many so-called Islamic sites that are being run by various groups that are openly anti-Muslim. But you don't, but in the front of that site, they don't tell you that, as to who's really running the site from the background. And so people look at these things and suddenly, form an opinion, or challenge what has been traditionally accepted with no real background. Yeah, I think I'll end here. It's 2:30 right now, so I'll end here as far as the get to the questions, inshallah. Anything on what I talked about today? Like I said, right now I just want to kind of go over some of the chronological aspects of Ahlul Bayt, and right now, because of course Imam Hassan and Imam Hussein Islam haven't been born where we've reached. That's why it's mainly been talking about Sayyidina Ali and Bibi Fatima Salamullah alayha, and not a whole lot about her at this point. We'll see that shift after the Hijrah, and actually we'll see that shift after the marriage to Ali radiallahu anhu. Because when you have a very bright light and you have other lights that are bright but not as bright as the other one, you can't see the other lights. Just like when the sun comes out, all of the stars disappear. And so in the when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is when she is in the house of her father, Bibi Fatima Salamullah alayha, in the house of her father, we really don't see a lot of aspects of her. When she shifts over to the house of her husband, then we start seeing different aspects of her. And also at this point she's very young. All right. Any questions?
I got one.
Okay. Brother Kelvin's got one, so.
Her name, I think it's Nasheba from the female companion from the
Uhud. Yeah, Nasiba bint Ka'b.
I looked at her name on YouTube. Of course, just trying to find out, and it says that she was the one that she asked Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, why is there no verses in the Quran about women? And that's when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed verses about women, because it talked about the men, but it didn't say men and women.
Yeah. The question is, whether she was the one who asked Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam why there are no verses addressing the women directly in the Quran. As far as but there's a difference of opinion as to whether it was her or someone else. Some people say that the question was asked by Hind bin Utbah in Mecca. But after that is when the verses, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed the verses, about, believing men and believing women and believing, righteous men and righteous women and so on and so forth. So yeah. And I think I'm going to talk about her in one of the Fridays soon, coming up soon, inshallah. But she is interesting, and her son was killed. One of her sons was killed by Musaylima Kadhab, the false prophet, or one of the false prophets. Okay. Yusuf, you had said you had something about Noor.
Yeah, I did.
But you got something else about today?
No, I'm trying to find it. Oh, yeah. So like, okay, last week you were equating Noor to like literal light on the electromagnetic spectrum. And so when we say Noor, is that one of the same? Or when we're talking about the Noor of evil, is this a completely...
No, Noor, yeah, Noor is a very broad term. Okay. And, so Noor, I mean, you could think of it sort of like an energy, because you see that yeah. Am I getting some feedback? No, okay. Yeah, so you can see that, like some people, they have this, this very You sense that good energy coming from them, and then you have other people who have, you know, that darkness, which is also an energy, you know, which is the opposite.
Yeah, like a hippie word is like an aura. Right?
Yes, yes. Yeah, but one thing to understand here is that, you know, so like we say that the angels, they're created from Nur. Okay. And we also talk about the Nur of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Okay. But the you know, but we know this, and we should know this anyway, but you know, in the night of the Miraj, you know, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and there's a lot of feedback there. The night of the Miraj.
Mute your phone once when you're talking to you. Hit that mute.
Yeah. So there's you know, when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you know, at Sidratul Muntaha, when he continues on, and Jibreel alayhi salam stops. And when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam asked him, why aren't you coming? He says that if I even go a hair's width beyond this point, all of my, you know, I will be annihilated. All of my wings will be burnt. I will be annihilated, because I cannot withstand, you know. So the Nur of Jibreel alayhi salam, you know, even though he is the leader of the angels, you know, so you can imagine, you know, his Nur, but his Nur can't withstand the presence of Allah. In that sense, and again, you know, some of this, you know, again, it's hard for us to conceptualize, you know, and this is why, you know, Miraj is such a great event. Yet the Nur of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam continues on. Okay? So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself has no difficulty in withstanding that awe. And so we see the difference, you know, this is just showing us the difference between that Nur and the other Nur. So not all Nur are equal. And even when you look at like the spectrum itself, you know, there are lights that we see, and then there are you know, there's light within that spectrum that we don't see.
Right.
Okay. And that's just the spectrum that we know. But again, you know, I mean, we can't really equate this to the spectrum, but we draw that analogy to kind of help us kind of have some grasp of understanding.
Okay.
Okay.
It sounds like it clearly transcends like physical reality.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
All right. So is that clear on that point?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Anything else?
Add on to that, so where would the angels be if the prophets, peace be upon them, are in the heavens? Where would the angels on in a different place? Or?
Yeah, Brother Kelvin is asking, you know, if the prophets, you know, like on the night of ascension, you know, on the various levels of the heavens, you know, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he meets various prophets, you know, but an important point to note here that most of us forget. When Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is making that journey, as he's going from Mecca to Jerusalem, he sees Musa alayhi salam in his grave, making salah. And then he sees Musa alayhi salam in Masjid al-Aqsa, waiting for him to arrive so he can pray behind Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then he again meets Musa alayhi salam on the sixth heaven. Alright. From our timeline, all of this happened in a moment, because, you know, again, you know, as we know, when he returned, the bed was still warm and the chain was still swinging from the gate. So the so he's all of those places essentially at the same time. And then the same thing, you know, he sees various other prophets at various other levels. The angels, you know, they are wherever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala orders them to be. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said that, you know, if we had the power to see and to hear them, you know, he said that the heavens are, you know, like when you're walking on a roof or on a wooden floor, and it's, you know, it's kind of cracking. So he says that the heavens are cracking, you know, with the you know, because of the weight, or as they're moving, as the movement of the angels. You know, we know that there are 70,000 that come and do tawaf every day, and their turn never returns. There are 70,000 that come in and say salam to Rasulullah every day, and their turn never comes back. So, you know, and like when there's a gathering talking about, you know, remembering Allah and His Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you know, they come and they sit in that gathering, and they sit on top of each other, you know, so that they can be closer to that gathering. And instead of sitting, you know, behind each other, they sit on top of each other, all surrounding that gathering. And so, you know, again, they are wherever they are wanted, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants them to be. And this also gets to where you can have two objects occupying the same space. This gets into all this other, you know, stuff. You know, but so these are not things that are beyond the reality of reality. You know, this is where you get that differentiation between haqiqah and sharia. Because sharia deals with what is apparent and what you can prove. Haqiqah is dealing with the reality behind everything. And we see this in the story of Musa al-Islam and Khizr al-Islam. That sort of, yeah, okay. Anything else? Well, should we end early?
No more questions, I guess.
Okay, so good. So either I explained everything very well, or I explained it in such a way no one understood anything. Yeah, so inshallah we'll end here today. And next week, you know, we'll kind of shift over to talking about Ahlul Bayt, you know, after the Hijrah, and this is when we'll start seeing, you know, other aspects to them. Because, you know, in Makkah, as I said, you know, there's so much torture going on. You know, it's basically everyone is in survival mode. And once they come to Medina Munawwara, even though the threat is always there, but now they're actually able to do things, and then we can start seeing their status and their positions, inshallah. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guide us and help us, and you know, fill our hearts with His love and the love of His beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and all of those whom they love, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.